Mike, over to you.
Yep. So I'm still trying to pull it up. It's amazing how like once something falls off. So this got moved to the done. So it's not like in the active track stuff. So it's almost impossible to find something that like isn't being um, done there. So I'll start by saying like this would be kind of similar to the last time I talked about something where this really isn't that great of a topic, but it might be, right? This is like two small little things that I feel like we'll just kick the hornet's nest here and see what happens. Um, so hold on just one second, still trying to pull this up. How is it? No. Apologize for just one second. At least we haven't recorded me fumbling trying to find this. All right, finally. Okay, so we recently did a pretty large feature flags redesign. And then, you know, it's always a good idea whenever you do make big changes like that to get it in front of folks and kind of just do some usability checks. So I won't go deep into the details of that because honestly, that actually went pretty well. But out of those kind of usability things, two little nuggets came out that like, it was my favorite moment when you're doing kind of usability, any kind of research stuff was like, oh, I wasn't even checking for that, right? I had just kind of glossed over this as like an accepted norm that, you know, is just a pattern in GitLab and kind of went with it. But actually during the interviews, multiple people, almost everybody kind of jumped on this. So that's why I wanted to bring those up because I think this is we can all learn from this type of moment. So let me share my screen here. So this is the feature flags kind of redesign, and this is the mock-up that I had made, prototype, that people were able to test on. So the first step here is really to create a new feature flag. So you go to this page here, which is very similar to how we do this, and particularly in a lot of places in CI/CD, like creating environments, struggling to find some other ones. But this pattern, I went with this because this seemed to be like kind of our de facto standard of what you do when you create something. So you come to this kind of like interstitial page where you name something, possibly give it a description. So in this, you would name it, give a description, then you hit save, and then you're dropped onto a form that has the rest of the details. So it turns out that was the pattern that people really didn't like. Some of the feedback that I got was actually like, yeah, I've never seen that before in GitLab, or like, I just want to be dropped onto the form itself. Like, I don't understand why there's a second step. One person did understand it. The only person that didn't dislike it took it as like, yeah, I get it. Like, it was a developer type where they're like, I'm creating a placeholder, so that makes sense. I create a placeholder, and then I go to this. So really, that's the crux of the first point that I really want to talk about is how are you guys handling this? I have this new thing that I need to create. Are you going through this kind of intermediate step of name something, give it a description, and then dropping you into kind of the bigger form like that? And have you guys had any friction with this, or is this just unique to this situation? So that's topic one. So the
Is there a technical, so the technical reason for that is that you first need the placeholder before actually setting up the flag, right? You first need kind of like the name it object before you start like messing with it, right?
Yeah, I mean, no, I actually don't think that there is. If you go to issues, um, issues kind of have this. So the other pattern that exists in GitLab is really more of like it is a bigger form. Issues is the weird one. Issues is like there's this editable part at the top, and you can edit the name and the description, but then the rest of the issue exists. So to answer your question, no, I don't think there is any technical reason why you would need that in between step there. This actually could all be one form.
Got it. Well, I think my first impression while seeing the naming part is that I wasn't sure what was gonna happen after that. So I don't mind having these broken down into 2 steps because that actually makes sense to me. I have seen this pattern used many things. I think that the only thing that kind of like throws me off a little bit is the fact that when you hit kind of like the call to action for the first step, you're not sure what's gonna happen. You don't have that expectation of what's the functionality or what's gonna happen after the fact that you do that. And I mean, I don't know. That's kind of like a first rough thought that I had about that.
Yeah, so would you say that you don't mind the pattern because you've seen it in GitLab before, or you don't mind the pattern because you don't mind the pattern?
No. I think
my
it
follow-up
makes
question.
no. I think that the pattern kind of makes sense to me in many ways because sometimes so I'm trying to think as a developer here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know that I wanna hide certain features that I'm working on, right? And I need feature flags for that, right? But I'm not exactly sure what's gonna be the strategy. I'm not exactly sure like about all these other details, right? The environments and all that stuff. But it makes sense to me that I can first create the placeholder, the object that it's gonna hold all that configuration, and then come back later and set this up, So that logic makes sense to me because basically it allows you to already have something, especially with something like a feature flag. You're working on a branch, you're doing things, you're setting up things back and forth. I don't know. It kind of makes sense to me that that would be the pattern.
Mike, can you go back like one screen to see the flow again, like from the beginning?
Yep. So you're on the feature flags list, right? So you've navigated to operations, feature flags. You have a list here that may be populated with, X number of feature flags. So up here in the upper right-hand group or right-hand corner, sorry, I was reading group there. Click on new feature flag. You're dropped on this kind of page that has a description, read more kind of situation, name and description. You would fill those out, click save button, and now you're dropped on a form that has the name and description kind of populated here, but now you are presented with the rest of the form.
Okay.
So so I don't know if you had a follow-up point to that, but I was going to compare it with the kind of new issue flow, right? Where it's new issue, where you have title, description, but you also have some other items here. So you could do this, and now you're dropped into the issue. So we do have this kind of pattern in GitLab of like, you go here, you do this, and then you're dropped into this, which I had just accepted this as the GitLab pattern and didn't even really think about it when I was creating the feature flags. I just kind of like went with what we went with. But I was very surprised to see that users were like, I don't understand why there's this extra step.
Yeah, I agree with Juan. I think what it's missing, like it's some indication of that exists the progressive disclosure there, that it's a stepper, right? Because you're starting with the step 1, and then when you save, you go to step 2. You don't go back to see the item you just created, for example, like with this one. So have you experimented with making clear to users that this is step 1 and you have 2, 3, or 4. You don't necessarily need to go through them, but you know that it's a linear, process. Have you tried
Yeah,
it out?
that's actually a great point. One of the users explicitly said exactly that. They're like, because I dove into that after like the third person kind of brought this up, you know, and I was aware of the problem. When they brought it up, I kind of was diving a little deeper on it, and they're like, yeah, the reason why I don't like it is because I don't know what that button is going to do in this step here, right? Where this save button, right? What they wanted there was I want to know what's going to happen after this because we know it's not really a save, it's something else kind of situation.
Yeah, that this could be, for example, save and continue or save and next,
Yeah.
right? I
Just
think
wanted to say.
I think what's missing is just the clues into what this flow is, and I don't know. Do I need to fill in everything in order to create a feature flag? Because it seems like um, the second step is not mandatory. But to go back to the previous one, it just, yeah, I think the flow is a bit, yeah, would be nice to get more context.
So do you guys think that we should define this holistically, like across GitLab? What I'm saying is should there be a defined flow for creating X item goes to this and then this?
You know,
Because there is variance in it. So where I got this from, I think the clearest example here is in environments, right? This is exactly copied from the environments flow, where you environment URL save.
well, I think there's difference between creating an environment or a feature flag and creating something like an issue or a merge request. And the big difference for me is that when you're creating an issue, you're creating this object that belongs to you.
Mhm.
It's basically you are the author of that object, right? You are, regardless if it changes assignee later or whatever, you were the one who originally created the object. So there's already kind of an anchor that belongs to you. And so that's just for saying that I think there's a big difference between creating loose objects like environments and feature flags and creating something like an issue. The reason why I'm saying that is because I was thinking about why would someone want to create a feature flag just with the name and the description. And if I'm thinking about a workflow, a random workflow, it kind of makes sense that, let's say I am the manager of a development team and I know which features need to be toggled for the next release, right? So I might go into the feature flags section and I might create 5 placeholders. Feature flag for comments, feature flag for showing the avatar, feature flag for blah, 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 right? That doesn't mean that I'm gonna set the configuration for all those things. That just means that I'm creating the placeholders so someone else can come and fill all those details. So in this particular case, there's no author, there's no like strong author experience.
Right.
So that's why it still kind of makes sense to me that it's broken down, because it almost feels like it's a loose thing. You know, it's something that can be created without impacting other people, without adding bottlenecks or anything. But that's definitely not a strong reason to believe that it shouldn't be everything in just a single form. I think that works too, because at the end of the day, the setting up the strategy and all that stuff is optional, right? It's not that you need to set it up from the beginning.
So if that's the case, does the flow make sense that you go like we did here of new description, save, but then dropped onto the bigger form? Should you maybe potentially be dropped back onto the list, right? I think would be the other interesting thing is if that is your mode of just, I want to create a bunch of things, so I'm just naming them, giving them descriptions, I'll worry about the details later. I could almost see you wanting to be dropped then back into the list so you can repeat that process as opposed to being dropped into the details.
Well, how do I know I can configure this, and where do I
Right.
go to configure it without going back to this one view that I already filled in, right? You go to the next step.
Yep, I agree. And I'm trying to find, I did find an example where you are dropped. We do have one, I can't remember off the top of my head, but we do have one where like you are literally, here's the entire form that you are dropped into.
Hey, can you
somewhere
do a
in
new environment again? I just want to see like what you did in the.
Sure. So new environment brings you to this page. Name, give it whatever you want. I'm not going to give it an external URL because it has to be valid, I think. You click on the save button, and now you are dropped here. So this environment really doesn't have any information because it's nothing's been deployed to it yet. And there is really nothing further here. Now this is an entity, right? Now that you don't really do any further editing on.
And so the question with the creation of so it seems like we have these two steps in the feature flag creation. With the first set of settings that the user is providing, like the name and the description, is this enough to have a feature flag, or you have to, in order for it to work, you have to have all of those additional settings that are on the page too?
No, this would be a valid feature flag at this point. You would have to change nothing else. It would be a kind of a silly feature flag because it's on for everybody. So if it's on for everybody, it in essence is like not creating a feature flag because it wouldn't actually do anything. It would be the same it would. So that I think is a topic for another day, is if the default here is the proper default.
Yeah.
But yes, this is a valid implementation right there. No errors would occur. You do not have to take any further action at this point. If your intention is just to create a placeholder feature flag, you have done that at this point.
Because, go ahead.
No, I was thinking something else. It's like the fact that this particular view is both read and write. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like, yes, you're reading the description, and you're reading the title, and there's like there's an edit button at the top. But then in the strategies, you can go and start messing with those fields and then save changes, right? Which makes me think, is that correct, right? I don't know. I'm wondering if what you need to do is enter into the edit state, and then in edit state, you can change all these things. That's how issues will work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is very similar to issues in the sense that you have now a name and a description that is kind of in a view state right now. And really, at this point, you're operating on the strategies, less so than the actual, name and description. This edit button would go back to this screen, essentially, which will allow you to edit there. And by the way, in case it's bothering anybody, yes, this is the incorrect button style. It should be a secondary button. I have fixed that.
I think this, to me at least, this configuration makes more sense with something as, I don't know, integrations. If you go, for example, in a project to operations, settings and integrations, operation integrations, something like that. Yeah. You see that, for example, if I have a cluster in my project, I can click configure existing installation, and then it takes me to a different form. This is the URL. Let me paste here. Let me can I share my screen?
Yep, go ahead.
Let's see. So I got here through operations metrics, right? It's landed on this page. And I do have an environment. I'm not sure if I have a cluster, probably not for this project. But then I have an item. I'm not sure why it doesn't display here. But then when I click configure existing installation, then it takes me to this view where I can, just play around with it. And it's kind of a mess. It's not super clear what I need to configure, but it's pretty much this cluster. So yeah, I created my cluster. I linked everything, and I can configure it in a different page. But I also wonder how this would look like, for example, if you had, I'm not sure if you already tried this, Mike, but having the form for creating the feature flag, but I don't know, collapsing this secondary part that is not mandatory, and allowing people to just navigate in one single form. Because was this a requirement to split the this into parts. That's the part where I'm still trying to wrap my head around. Where is
No,
this?
no, no. Yeah. So my point here is that I took this as a pattern of in GitLab that we have been using and just ran with it. Didn't even think about it.
Okay.
And was surprised that there was pushback on it, given that this is how most things in GitLab flow. So the point here in bringing this up was like, I'm less worried about the solution for feature flags. I'm more worried about like, are we using the right pattern across GitLab? And I just did find the other way that this kind of does happen in snippets is actually an example of so if I create a new snippet, I have one form to do that does it all. Has the title, has the description, but also has the things that I need to create there. And if I have created one, you are now in kind of this view that is very issue-ish. And the edit form is back to this whole form.
Okay. The danger I see there is that this is not the way it's supposed to be. Snippets, for example, is something that we did research in it, and Laurie, maybe you can you have more context on it, that people are not really using snippets, and this was built ages ago. So I believe that this page does not comply with pajamas or with design guidelines at all. So I think it's also a risk to look at it for, as a reference.
Gotcha. And for further, so one thing I did was intentional in my design here was I hate this idea that there is no view state of the name and description in our current implementation of feature flags, right? This is always an edit form. There is no world where I can like view the name and description. It's always going to be in a form like that, which to me is very unreadable.
Well, that's pretty bad.
I much prefer having it in an edit state like this, because 9 times out of 10 when you're here, you're consuming this, possibly doing the strategies. You're not going to be, I don't think your primary action is to go here and rename and or change the description of it. You are here to operate on the strategies portion of it. So I don't like this pattern. This is what I was kind of trying to get away from. But it is worth, so our current feature flag as it works today is this. You are dropped into this form with the name and description. So we absolutely could do this, right? The creation of it could have the name and the description as the top part as just a form. And then subsequent editing of it would be, maybe kind of a 2-step edit where you can either edit strategies or edit that. I struggle with that a little bit though, because then your creation and your editing have different looking forms, and that's extra development that the front end folks are going to need to do.
Now that I think about it, issues is, did we say that issues is different from this pattern?
Issues is interesting.
Because I feel issues is basically this exact same pattern that you're showing. With the difference that issues has like more things to set up at the beginning from configuration description perspective. You gotta set an assignee, a milestone, labels, whatever, those things are optional. But it's not like you can create a comment right away on the issue from the beginning. You need to create the issue, and then you can go and then you can comment, or you can link new issues, or you can do or create a merge request out of the issue. So if you compare those two flows, they're very similar in that sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and to me, this is my favorite pattern of create, you're dropped on the thing. I mean, this is kind of why I went with it, was issues, and then the editing of it, where you can edit the name and the description right there in line. I do like that a lot, as opposed to the pattern where you edit and you go to this other page there. But yeah, to me, it was just an interesting, like I said, I wasn't even really testing it, and now I'm thinking about it, and we're kind of all over the place in GitLab of that. And I'm not one to say that their consistency is the ultimate goal here. I'm a big believer that if you're going to be different, it's okay, but it should be different for a reason, right? Your differences should be intentional. And I don't necessarily know that we have a clear, like, we do it this way in this place for this reason. We do it this way in this place for this reason. So
Yeah, I like how you're saying it. We have to start from the consistency point of view, but every flow should be relevant to the feature and to the case. Because here, yeah, it's like I guess something that I wanted to say, like this save button. It makes me think that I will save it and I will finish with the process, but then it drops me to another screen. So where it says saved changes, and like usually the buttons should be named whatever they're doing. So it would be like I continue to filling in settings, or you know, like whatever, or like make it finish there, and like maybe add another button to say, you know, like add more details or something like that. Because that green button save is really misleading to me in that case. Yep. I guess if I would be going through the flow for the first time, I would be also expecting just to finish there, but then it's like another thing pops up because yeah.
I wonder if there's a way to just make subtle changes to the second page in the form and just change it to the detail view of the feature flag, so that we kind of circumvent the issue of a two-step form. The first form is just creating a flag, and then you are dropped onto its detail view where you can edit the environments or whatever the details are from there. And that follows the pattern we have with issues. And that seems to be the most common pattern I've seen at GitLab, is like the minimum to create the entity, and then you go to the detail view to make changes or make it more robust or provide information. And it seems like it would be a pretty subtle design shift.
I think it still doesn't solve the problem of people not knowing that there's more coming once they create the item. You know, maybe we can, I don't know, add a helper or something in the UI saying that, yeah, after creating, you can do this, this, and that, and manage it in a different view. I like the proposal, but I'm worried with the helping users figuring out what to do next.
Yeah. Is there an easy option for the details? It's like, here's a list of common patterns, or like 5 default that you can put in while you're creating it, and then leave like more intricate editing for that secondary view to kind of circumvent the issue of we don't know what's coming next. We provide like, here's the basics we assume, or you could choose none of them and just go to the details anyway. Does that make sense?
I guess you could solve it with the copyright as well, because instead of saying saving, you could be like save and continue or something, and give the expectation that there's something to come.
Yeah, I think that's, I think at a minimum, you know, I think the big variance is what this button says, right?
Right.
And maybe that's why the flow works for issues and doesn't work in feature flags. Maybe I was a little bit over assumptive that when people didn't like it in feature flags, it's because they didn't like the pattern, but it might just be the subtle detail of the text of the thing might bring it back into the fold of the pattern there. So, okay. I'll play with that and I'll update from there. Appreciate the feedback. It's awesome. And I think my intent here was hopefully we start thinking about like these patterns a little bit more holistically across GitLab. And because I think it's dangerous, right? With us, I think Hayan has been here the longest, but we're talking 2 years, right? So sometimes you inherit these patterns and it's easy to just say, yeah, that's how it works in GitLab, and we do it, right? And that's great most of the time, but it's terrible some of the time. And I think it's just one of those, like, you know, be willing to question everything as you're going along type of things.
Well, for sure, don't always take the product as the source of truth,
right?
Especially those things that they don't look ideal, right? They're not polished. There's so much legacy in the product, and that's why it's difficult to look at, for example, pajamas for guidelines, but then the product shows something completely different. So my take on this is, when in doubt, try to reach out to whoever is the DRI or the designer responsible for a specific functionality and ask, what are the planned improvements? Because yeah, there's a lot of things in the product that they shouldn't work the way they work today. So don't replicate the patterns if it's not ideal.
Okay, the second topic that I wanted to discuss was slightly less interesting. Let's see if I can get to it. Was really around the people did not like. I have always done this because we tend to do name, description, and the buttons are top aligned with the name. Um, People found that to be visually disconnected from this list. So what I've done to fix that is just make this text wrap and move this button down so it's aligned with the description as opposed to that. But it does bring up another like, and again, this is the incorrect button. This should be a secondary button. Try and look past that. Is the idea of it's always, this is an age-old UX problem of like lists, right? Are you going to put the add button at the top so it's always in the same place? Or are you going to put the add button at the bottom of the list because really that's where it's going to show up, right? So it could very easily be here or there or both. So that was the second little topic, if we want to dive into it, is when you have a list of things, where do you guys like to put the add button? At the top, at the bottom, or both? And should that vary, or should we be consistent in that?
I normally put on top next to the title, the label. And it really depends, because if it's for example, if it's a call to action that works for the whole page. So for example, create feature flag or create release, then it's green, like what you're using here.
Mm.
But if not, yeah, it should be a secondary button. But I see that in this case, even the secondary could, I don't know, the expand and the edit, they're all gonna look alike. So it's a bit, and the cancel even. So it will be a bit odd in this sense. But as far as I know, yeah, top of the section. And then you start adding content on the list. I'm trying to find if Pajama has guidelines on that as well.
How many strategies can you, is it common to have 20, for instance, something crazy?
It'll be interesting to see. We don't know yet. Our current implementation, let me go back to sharing that, is Crazy Town. If I can say Crazy Town and have that be meaningful. Where am I sharing? No, not that one. Where's this one? Anyways, currently our feature flags require you can create a bunch of strategies, but you can only define one per environment, which doesn't make a lot of sense because there's absolutely a use case for wanting multiple feature flags per environment. So a lot of this change was around kind of flipping that idea to allow you to create strategies. You used to have to create environments and add strategies to them. We're flipping it on its head and allowing you to create strategies and add environments to them. So my point in all that is that we don't know what people will do from a strategy standpoint because you haven't been able to do that yet. Looking at competitors and talking to users, I would say it's probably going to be a couple, right? It's not 100 strategies per feature flag. It's not one usually. It's like, here's this main use case. And then here's maybe one or two other like edge cases that you need to account for. So like roll it out to 50% of your users, but you also need to give it to Steve, who's the like admin for everything.
Got
right?
it. Yeah. No, I was asking because if it was gonna be a long list, when you lose visibility of that button, then it might make some sense to have the add as part of the list, like the last element, so you can create a new one. But if it's not gonna be, if it's just a couple, then you're always gonna have visibility of the button in the viewport. So it makes sense that it's at the top, right?
Yep. So this was the updates of that. Yeah, I agree. Like, I think that's the problem. I think, and it's one of the tough things about user testing because they're like, no, I want it at the bottom because that's where it's going to add up. But they're not thinking about like the edge cases of like, what if I did have 50? I can't see the button anymore. So it's one of those, like, you have to take it with a grain of salt kind of things. I think that's why we always tend to put them up at the top, because of that reason, is we have to account for both cases. And I think in the minimum case, it works, and in the maximum case, it still works. Whereas if we put them at the bottom, it works in the minimum case, but in the maximum case, it's a disaster. So this was the update to that. Was basically what I was saying is making this text wrap, aligning it with that, and giving it a secondary button, since we have create would be the primary button.
And if you press the add strategy button, will the item, the new item appear at the top or at the bottom of the list here?
Unfortunately, at the bottom, which if it does get long enough will be a problem. So
Does it jump? Does it scroll to that, or?
it hasn't been built yet, so
Okay.
I definitely think that that's a good spec to add in there, though, right? If it define page scroll to the new item.
Yeah, if that's a popular pattern in GitLab, I'm curious what does that pattern then do?
Yeah.
And if that wasn't built yet, why then the decision is to add it at the bottom? But is that also a pattern that we have?
No, it's interesting. Maybe it should go at the top. The one constraint that we have to work with is you need to have one, right? So if you notice here, you can't delete this first one because you have to have at least one strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the only kind of weird thing is I think as an MVC, that's tons of extra code. When I was talking to the front end guys about adding that of how to deal with that, right? So you have to have one. So it's much easier for them to code there is just one that's stuck there and you can modify that one if you want, and then adding always adds below it. I think a future iteration would be you always have to have one, so it does push down, and the only time you can't delete is if it's the last one.
Yeah.
Right here we're like just doing the shortcut of there's one that you can't delete.
It's also probably from a hierarchy perspective, it's likely that you first define the most relevant strategy and then you define the least relevant, right? So there's already some kind of hierarchy here. So if you keep adding them on the stack from the top, then it's gonna look weird. I mean, at least for me, the way that I'm thinking about it is gonna be, oh, the least relevant one is the first one and the most important strategy is the last one in the list, right? Which kind of creates a little bit of a mind jumble. Like in my case, it felt that like you should respect the hierarchy of creation because that's how I will think about adding strategies, right? I'm first thinking about the most important one and then I create the other ones as they happen.
Yeah, and the upshot, this did test well in the usability thing. So this is one thing I was concerned about. So the task was come in here and set up this feature flag to do this, right? And 5 out of the 6 people, their first thought was to modify the default strategy as opposed to adding in an additional strategy. So and then the step after that was, okay, well, we also want to do this other thing. So at that point they would add strategy. So the mental model was playing out well of, I'm coming here, I want to set up my main strategy to do this. Users were tending to modify this default strategy to be the settings that it needed to be. And if they needed to do something else, then they were doing this add strategy, which does make it, make sense, like you were saying, Juan, in that one's at the top because it's the main one, and the ones below that are kind of supplemental to that. So that was positive. That did test well.
Kind of a small comment, but have you tried instead of using add strategy, just using the plus icon there, Mike?
I have not. I guess my hesitation would be like, why make it, why, right? It's visually less impactful. If anything I would want to do would make this visually more impactful. And the plus button would be a smaller one. Now, I think what would be interesting would be maybe if we had an add strategy button at the top and maybe a plus button at the bottom as kind of a secondary, like if that's where you want to go is at the bottom of the list, add it there. That might be an interesting one, so that you can add it here and add it there. But up here, I think it would get lost visually a little bit. And if there's anything that I wanted, although I don't even think this is really a problem. All 6 users were able to find this add strategy button with almost no problem. The only reason I brought up this point is that they just didn't like, where is it? They didn't like this pattern, right? Where it was lined up here and this went like this. Like visually, they felt like this was disconnected from that, which is what we do all the time in GitLab. Like we always align buttons to headers, not to, and we don't wrap descriptions like that. So I think that we should stop doing that. I think we should start doing this, where we wrap descriptions and align buttons to headers, because I think it is visually more connected to the list. But all users, even with that slight disconnect, everybody was able to find it with ease. So I'm not bringing this up to like try to solve a problem. I'm bringing it up to say I think this should be the pattern moving forward.
Very cool. And what happens when I click the environment, that little plus icon there?
Let me show you.
Oh my God.
All right, so let's just go through the demo. It'd be fun. So I add new feature flag. I give it a description. I save it. Drop down. I can pick what type of strategy I want. Given the task that you were given in this test, you want percent rollout. Here you just add in a percent. And then the next task was about environments. So click on the plus, it drops down there. We have this search box. Now this is not how it works. When I click this, 2 of these things are going to add up just because the branching and the logic of the prototype was too hard. But how it would work in real life is this would work like the label selection, where it's a multi-selection. So you click this one, click outside of it. But if you do that, you get these little pills here. You can add and remove there. Then add strategy, add the second one. User IDs? Yeah, user IDs. Add that. I think environments. Oh no, that's
Can I add a few comments actually here? So looking at the into this flow, I would just like thinking out loud 2 suggestions. So the for me, the add strategy button, it looks a bit like, I agree with probably with those people, it looks like too much on the right. It's kind of like, because I'm looking at this side and the button is on that side. So it's kind of like out of my range. If that would be, I'm curious, like if you would run this user test on me and the button would be secondary, I probably would totally even miss that in the beginning. I would probably have to search for that. Of course, it's like right now, I'm maybe a little bit biased since I didn't run this task without discussions anymore. So 2 things. For me, this button asks, the add strategy button asks maybe to be below the description, below the strategist title, like, like strategist title, then the description. And then I would probably add it there, aligned to the left, just brainstorming. And I would probably name it like new strategy or add another strategy, because add strategy, and then I realized, hey, there is already strategy below. So kind of like this is my a little bit of a fresh thinking looking into this page, since I haven't seen this UI much before. Just 2 things out there.
That one was interesting, being on the left. I do feel like that is GitLab law, that plus buttons are always on the right. Our action buttons are almost always on the right. I agree. It might be interesting putting on the left, but I do feel like that is not to say that
I figured, yeah.
consistency should not rule all, but I do feel like that is pretty well established that add is always on the right, or action really is on the right, other than this footer bar where there's usually a primary and a secondary. But it's definitely worth playing with. I can play with that and see.
For environment, your plus button is on the left.
Yeah, this is definitely not. Well, it's, I forget where I stole that from, but it's definitely, that's definitely new to GitLab. Let's put it that way. I think, and I think it. I think we need it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, just make sure you feed this back to Pajamas, Mike, if it becomes a pattern, because yeah, we need to document this so that people know that this decision was based on, I don't know, user insights, and that you did testing and they can find where this information came from. I'm just a bit like, when I look at it, I'm kind of lost with, there's so many different ways to add and create and save because of all the buttons and all the positions. And I kind of agree with Nadia, maybe experimenting with moving add strategy somewhere else and putting add new strategy. I think that would be make clearer. But I asked about the plus button because I saw the plus on adding an environment. So it's the plus, it's the icon, but add strategy, it's in text, and edit, it's an icon. So kind of those things that we see also in the current product, and the most implementations that we have all these different different labels. And just I don't know, wanted to understand a bit better the flow, because I think in general this can also impact you know, the discoverability of those actions if people look at it and they have to read and get familiar with all these different button types.
Yep, I agree. And I really like the idea of add new strategy as opposed to just strategy. If for nothing else, it makes the button bigger. And I think bigger is better in this, right? Like if anybody is struggling for it, and it's not like the description can wrap. It's not like we're in a space crunch there. So
Yeah.
I'll definitely make that change. And yeah, I can play with it being other places. Although again, I will say this, 6 out of 6 of like, yep, got it first time was easy. So I don't think we're that far off.
Yeah. Well, thanks for presenting this all. For me, this was definitely an interesting discussion, and nice to see kind of like consistency versus logic type of thinking. So yeah, I guess feel free to come back with this in few sessions like that if you will need any follow-up. But definitely thanks for showing this work, and thanks everyone for discussions.
Yeah, thank you everybody. It was great feedback.
See you in the UX weekly soon. Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
Well.